You think you're human. You wake up, look in the mirror, recognize the face staring back. You go about your day with the quiet certainty that you know what you are. But what if I told you that this confidence is the greatest illusion you've ever entertained? What if the thing looking out through your eyes right now isn't a finished product, but a question mark, a becoming, a chrysalis wrapped around something that hasn't yet emerged? Terence McKenna spent his life trying to articulate this peculiar vertigo, this sense that human beings are not a destination, but a doorway, not a noun, but a verb still conjugating itself in the grammar of cosmic evolution. Consider for a moment the sheer improbability of your existence, not just the biological lottery of your birth, though that's staggering enough, but the vast archaeological layering of consciousness that had to occur for you to even have the capacity to wonder about yourself. Billions of years ago, matter learned to replicate. Then it learned to sense, then to move, then to remember, then to imagine. Each step an impossible leap, each leap a kind of death and resurrection. And now, here you are, a being capable of contemplating its own contemplation, aware of your own awareness, asking questions that spiral into infinite regress. Do you really think this is where the story ends? Do you honestly believe that evolution, having come this far, simply stopped at the invention of the human nervous system? McKenna understood something that most of us intuitively feel but struggle to articulate: that consciousness itself is not a possession, but a process, not something we have, but something we're being had by. Look at the history of life on this planet, and you'll see a clear trajectory, a directionality that moves from simplicity toward complexity, from the mechanical toward the aware, from the determined toward the free. Single-celled organisms give way to multicellular colonies. Neural networks emerge from the primordial soup. Brains grow, fold, elaborate themselves into cathedrals of electrochemical signaling. And at some critical threshold, the universe becomes conscious of itself through these peculiar arrangements of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen that we call bodies. But why would this process stop with us? We're so narcissistically convinced of our own completeness, so thoroughly identified with this current configuration of consciousness, that we can't imagine there might be something beyond it, something as different from our present state as we are different from the fish that first crawled onto land. Those fish didn't know they were becoming land animals. They were just following some dim impulse, some biochemical imperative coded into their cells. And we, right now, in this very moment, are following impulses we barely understand, drawn toward a transformation we can sense but not yet see. The evidence is everywhere if you know how to look. Think about the acceleration of human development, the exponential curve of our technological and cultural evolution. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in relatively stable patterns, hunting and gathering, telling stories around fires, worshipping the sun and the moon. Then, in the blink of an evolutionary eye, everything changes. Agriculture, cities, writing, mathematics, the printing press, the scientific method, electricity, computers, the internet. Each innovation collapsing the timeline further, each breakthrough bringing us closer to something that hovers just beyond the horizon of conceivability. McKenna called this the transcendental object at the end of time. But don't let the mystical language fool you. This isn't just poetic metaphor. This is a rigorous attempt to describe a phenomenon that's actually occurring, a strange attractor pulling human consciousness forward into increasingly novel configurations. We're not just evolving biologically anymore. We're evolving consciously, culturally, technologically. We're weaving ourselves into planetary networks of communication. We're extending our senses through instruments that can detect gravitational waves and subatomic particles. We're beginning to manipulate the very genetic code that created us. These aren't random developments. These are the birth pangs of something trying to emerge through us. And this is where it gets truly vertiginous. What if you, in the individual sense, is just a temporary eddy in a much larger current? What if the person you think you are, with all your memories and preferences and fears and desires, is just a mask that something infinitely older and stranger is wearing? The universe didn't spend 14 billion years arranging itself into stars and galaxies and planets just so you could pay your taxes and worry about what people think of you. There's something else happening here, something that uses the vehicle of individual consciousness, but isn't limited to it, something that's trying to wake itself up through the collective dreaming of billions of human minds. This isn't metaphysics in the abstract sense. This is phenomenology, the direct investigation of experience itself. When you truly pay attention to consciousness, when you strip away all the cultural conditioning and psychological defense mechanisms and stories you tell yourself, what remains? There's awareness itself, this strange luminous presence that exists prior to thought, prior to identity, prior to the very distinction between subject and object. And this awareness doesn't belong to you. You belong to it. It was here before you were born, and it will be here after you die. The individual human being is just a temporary localization of this awareness, a particular flavor it's experiencing, a specific question it's asking itself. McKenna intuited that psychedelic experiences, particularly those induced by psilocybin and DMT, offered glimpses into this larger reality. But he was careful to note that these substances weren't creating anything new. They were simply dissolving the filters that normally constrain consciousness to the narrow bandwidth we call ordinary waking reality. When those filters drop away, even momentarily, you see that what you thought was the totality of existence was actually just a thin slice, a single channel on an infinite radio dial. And what you encounter in those expanded states isn't alien or other. It's somehow more you than you've ever been, more real than anything you've previously considered real. But here's the crucial point that's easy to miss. The goal isn't to permanently remain in those expanded states. The goal is to integrate their lessons back into ordinary life, to bring that wider perspective into the daily texture of human experience. We're not trying to escape the human condition. We're trying to complete it, to fulfill the promise that's been encoded in matter since the Big Bang first flung itself into existence. We're the universe's way of knowing itself, yes, but more than that. We're the universe's way of becoming something it hasn't been before. The great trap is thinking that evolution is behind us, something that happened to our ancestors, but not something that's happening right now, in this moment, as you read these words. We've been taught to imagine evolution as a slow, grinding process, measured in millions of years, a process visible only in fossils and genetic drift. But that's biological evolution, the mutation and selection of physical forms. What's happening now is different in kind, though not in essence. It's the evolution of consciousness itself, and it operates on a completely different timescale, measured not in geological epochs, but in generations, lifetimes, moments. McKenna was fascinated by the notion that human beings occupy a unique position in the cosmic unfolding. We're not the pinnacle of creation, we're the pivot point, the hinge between the determined past and the open future. Everything that came before us was largely governed by deterministic laws, by cause and effect, by the blind algorithm of natural selection. But with the emergence of self-reflective consciousness, something genuinely new entered the universe: the capacity for choice, for imagination, for the deliberate shaping of reality according to intentional designs. We can conceive of things that don't exist and then bring them into being. We can imagine alternative futures and work to actualize them. This is an utterly unprecedented power, and we're still barely learning how to use it. Think about language for a moment. We take it so completely for granted that we forget how absolutely bizarre and miraculous it is. Somehow, through arbitrary sounds or marks on a page, one mind can transmit configurations of meaning directly into another mind. I'm encoding thoughts into words right now, and as you decode them, similar patterns are lighting up in your neural networks. This is a form of telepathy, a genuine merging of consciousness across space and time. The person who wrote these words might be dead by the time you read them, yet their thoughts continue to live in your mind, shaping your understanding, influencing your behavior. Language is the beginning of a collective consciousness, the first technology that allowed individual minds to pool their insights and discoveries. But language is also a prison. It carves up the seamless flow of reality into discrete categories. It reifies processes into things, turns verbs into nouns, makes the fluid appear solid. When we name something, we stop seeing it freshly and start seeing our concept of it instead. This is both language's power and its limitation. It allows us to accumulate knowledge across generations, but it also traps us in inherited categories, in ossified ways of thinking that may no longer serve us. Every age inherits the language of the previous age, and with that language comes a whole worldview, a set of unexamined assumptions about what's real and what's possible. The human being, as currently configured, is a creature suspended between two modes of consciousness. On one hand, we have the ancient limbic brain, the emotional, instinctual, tribal mind that evolved over millions of years to keep us alive in dangerous environments. This is the part of us that craves security, that fears the unknown, that wants to belong to a group and conform to its norms. It's conservative in the literal sense. It wants to conserve, to maintain, to keep things as they are. And on the other hand, we have the neocortex, this recent evolutionary addition that gives us abstract reasoning, symbolic thinking, the capacity to imagine alternatives to the present moment. This is the revolutionary part of the brain, the part that wants to explore, to experiment, to transcend current limitations. These two systems are in constant tension, and that tension is felt as anxiety, as existential discomfort, as the sense that something is fundamentally wrong or incomplete about the human condition. We're animals who know we're animals, creatures of instinct who can reflect on our instincts and choose to override them. This creates a split, a gap between what we are and what we know we might become. And that gap is precisely where human creativity and suffering both emerge. We're caught in between, not quite animal, and not yet whatever comes next. McKenna suggested that this in-between state is intensifying, that the tension is building towards some kind of resolution or breakthrough. He pointed to the increasing strangeness of the world, the way reality seems to be accelerating, becoming more complex, more interconnected, more surreal. Things that would have taken centuries to unfold now happen in years. Technologies that seemed like science fiction become commonplace. The old structures of meaning, the traditional stories we told ourselves about who we are and why we're here, are visibly collapsing. And into that collapse, something new is trying to be born. But what is this new thing? That's the question that haunted McKenna, and it should haunt us too. We can't know it from our current position, just as a caterpillar dissolving in its chrysalis can't conceptualize the butterfly it's becoming. The caterpillar doesn't have the sensory apparatus to imagine wings or the capacity to conceive of flight. All it experiences is dissolution, the terrifying breakdown of everything it thought it was. And that's where we are now, collectively. The old human being, the one defined by nation-states and ideologies and economic systems and religious dogmas, is visibly coming apart. And we don't yet know what's coming together in its place. What we do know is that consciousness is not a static property, but a dynamic process, and like all processes, it's subject to transformation. The consciousness you're experiencing right now is different from the consciousness of a medieval peasant, which was different from the consciousness of a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer. Not just in content, though that's certainly true, but in structure, in the very quality and texture of awareness itself. Our ancestors inhabited different phenomenological worlds, different ways of experiencing time, space, causality, selfhood. And our descendants, assuming we have any, will inhabit yet stranger worlds, will possess modes of awareness we can barely imagine. The question is whether this transformation will be conscious or unconscious, intentional or accidental, guided or chaotic. Will we actively participate in our own evolution, or will we be swept along by forces we don't understand? This is the real meaning of spiritual practice, the true purpose of philosophy and art and psychedelic exploration. To become aware of the process that's moving through us, to consciously align ourselves with the directionality of consciousness itself. Not to resist the transformation, because resistance is futile, but to cooperate with it, to become its willing partners rather than its unconscious vehicles. And this requires a fundamental shift in identity, a letting go of the small self with all its fears and ambitions and neuroses. This isn't about self-improvement in the conventional sense, about becoming a better version of the person you think you are. It's about recognizing that the person you think you are is itself a construct, a narrative overlay on something much more vast and mysterious. When you truly investigate the sense of being a separate individual, when you really look for this I that seems to be navigating through life, you can't find it. What you find instead is just awareness itself, sometimes identified with thoughts, sometimes identified with sensations, sometimes identified with nothing at all, just present, luminous, aware. There's a particular quality to the present moment in human history that McKenna was trying to articulate, a sense of compression, of intensification, as if everything is speeding up and converging towards some kind of nexus point. You can feel it in the air, in the zeitgeist, in the barely suppressed hysteria of the news cycle and the frantic scrolling of social media feeds. We're drowning in information, but starving for wisdom. We're more connected than ever, but lonelier than we've ever been. We have technologies that our grandparents would have considered magical, yet we use them primarily to distract ourselves from the growing sense that something essential is missing. What's missing is meaning, but not meaning in the superficial sense of purpose or direction. What's missing is a felt sense of participation in something larger than ourselves, a visceral understanding of our role in the cosmic story. For most of human history, this sense of participation was provided by religion, by mythology, by cultural narratives that situated the individual within a larger metaphysical framework. You were a child of God, or a warrior in the cosmic battle between good and evil, or a soul working through karma over multiple lifetimes. These stories gave shape to experience, made suffering comprehensible, provided a context within which individual life had significance. But we've lost those stories without replacing them with anything adequate. The scientific worldview, for all its tremendous power and validity, doesn't provide existential orientation. It tells us what things are made of and how they function, but it doesn't tell us what they mean or why they matter. It describes the mechanics of the universe, but remains silent on the question of purpose. And so we find ourselves in the bizarre position of knowing more about the cosmos than any previous generation, while simultaneously feeling more alienated from it, more disconnected from the living fabric of reality. McKenna's genius was to recognize that this crisis is actually an opportunity, that the breakdown of old meaning structures is a necessary precondition for the emergence of something more authentic, more direct, more experientially grounded. Instead of inheriting our worldview from authority figures and ancient texts, we can investigate reality directly, phenomenologically, through disciplined exploration of consciousness itself. The psychedelic experience, properly approached, is not an escape from reality, but a deeper engagement with it, a method for stripping away the layers of cultural conditioning and seeing the world with fresh eyes, as if for the first time. And what you see when you look with those fresh eyes is astonishing. The sheer fairness of things, the inexplicable fact that anything exists at all. Why is there something rather than nothing? That's the fundamental question, the primordial mystery that all philosophy ultimately circles back to. And the answer, if there is one, can't be found in concepts or theories. It can only be encountered directly, in the lived experience of existence itself. You are the universe's answer to its own question. The fact that you exist, that awareness is illuminating this particular corner of space-time through the vehicle of your nervous system, is itself the miracle, the magic, the meaning. But we've become so habituated to existence that we no longer notice how strange it is. We walk around in a kind of trance, lost in thought, identified with our mental narratives, barely present to the actual sensory richness of the world. We think about the past and worry about the future, and miss the only place where life actually happens. Right here, right now, in this eternal present moment that's always already the case. The spiritual traditions have been pointing to this for millennia, but we keep missing it because we're looking for something complicated, and what's being pointed to is utterly simple. Just this: just now, just awareness being aware. Yet there's a paradox here that McKenna understood deeply. On one hand, the message is one of radical simplicity. Wake up, be present, recognize what you already are. But on the other hand, waking up reveals a reality of staggering complexity, of infinite depth and dimensionality. It's not that you discover some bland, undifferentiated unity. What you discover is that the unity contains all multiplicity, that the simple awareness at the core of your being is simultaneously the source of all the elaborate structures of reality. Consciousness doesn't just observe the world, it generates it, or at the very least participates in its generation in ways we're only beginning to understand. This is where McKenna's thought becomes genuinely radical and challenging to conventional materialism. He was suggesting that mind is not a byproduct of matter, but that matter might be a specific expression of mind, that consciousness is not an emergent property of sufficiently complex physical systems, but the primary ontological category, the ground of being itself. This sounds mystical, and in a sense it is, but it's also strangely consistent with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics and the hard problem of consciousness that continues to baffle neuroscientists and philosophers. How does subjective experience arise from objective physical processes? How do you get the feeling of redness from electromagnetic waves of a certain frequency? How do you get the taste of coffee, or the sound of music, or the emotion of love from neurons firing in particular patterns? The explanatory gap seems unbridgeable because we're trying to derive the qualitative from the quantitative, the experiential from the mechanical. But what if we have it backwards? What if consciousness is fundamental, and matter is what consciousness looks like from the outside, from the third-person perspective? This isn't just abstract philosophy. This is about understanding your own nature, about recognizing what you actually are beneath the social masks and psychological defenses and biological imperatives. And what you are, fundamentally, is not a thing, but an opening, not an object, but a space within which objects appear. You're the clearing in which experience unfolds, the awareness in which thoughts and sensations and perceptions arise and dissolve. And this awareness is not personal. It's not yours in any meaningful sense. It's impersonal, universal, the same awareness looking out through all eyes, listening through all ears, thinking through all minds. When this recognition dawns, even momentarily, something shifts. The usual sense of being a separate individual struggling to survive in a hostile world loosens its grip. You see that you're not in the universe is in you. You're not a subject encountering objects. You're the field within which the subject-object distinction appears. This isn't a belief or a philosophy, it's a direct recognition, an experiential truth that you can verify for yourself through investigation of your own immediate awareness. And here's what McKenna was really getting at. This recognition is not the end point, but the beginning. Once you see through the illusion of separation, once you recognize your essential nature as consciousness itself, the question becomes, what do you do with that recognition? How does it change the way you live? How does it inform your relationships, your work, your creative expression, your engagement with the world? Because the point is not to become enlightened in some static sense, to achieve some permanent state of bliss and withdrawal. The point is to bring that recognition into manifestation, to let it transform everything, to allow the universe to experience itself more fully through this particular human form. We need to talk about time, because time is where McKenna's vision becomes most provocative and difficult to grasp. We experience time as a linear flow from past through present into future, with events arranged in a sequence of cause and effect. This seems so obvious, so self-evidently true, that we rarely question it. But what if this linear model of time is itself a construct, a perceptual framework that we impose on a reality that's actually far stranger and more fluid than our everyday experience suggests? McKenna was drawn to the idea, found in various mystical traditions and even in certain interpretations of physics, that time might not be what it seems. He explored the notion that the future is not an empty space waiting to be filled, but a kind of attractor, pulling the present toward it. In this view, novelty, complexity, and consciousness are not randomly emerging, but are being drawn forward by something that already exists in potential, something that's calling to itself across time, organizing matter and energy into increasingly sophisticated patterns that can eventually recognize and understand their own nature. This is the transcendental object at the end of time that McKenna spoke of so frequently. He imagined it as the culmination of the evolutionary process, the point toward which all of cosmic history has been aiming. But he was careful to note that this endpoint exists not just in the chronological future, but also in the eternal now, that it's both approaching us and already here, hidden within the depths of every present moment. The future, in this understanding, is not something that will happen, but something that is happening, exerting a kind of backward causation that shapes the present from ahead rather than from behind. Does this sound insane? Perhaps. But consider the phenomenon of teleology, the apparent goal-directedness of evolutionary processes. An acorn somehow knows to become an oak tree. A caterpillar somehow knows to build a chrysalis and metamorphose into a butterfly. The DNA in a fertilized egg somehow contains the instructions to build an entire organism with all its staggering complexity. Where does this knowledge come from? How does the present contain information about a future state that doesn't yet exist? The conventional answer is that it's all coded in the genes, that natural selection has sculpted these developmental programs over millions of years. But that just pushes the mystery back one step. It doesn't explain the origin of the organizing principle itself. McKenna intuited that consciousness might operate according to a similar principle on a much larger scale. Just as the mature oak tree exists as a potential in the acorn, the fully awakened universe might exist as a potential in the present moment of human consciousness. And we might be the means by which that potential actualizes itself, the bridge between what is and what will be. This is not determinism, because the future is not fixed. It's probabilistic, branching, full of multiple possibilities. But there might be strange attractors in the phase space of possibilities, configurations toward which the system naturally tends to evolve. And if this is true, then what we call spiritual awakening or enlightenment or cosmic consciousness might be a preview of coming attractions, a glimpse of where evolution is headed. The mystical experiences reported across cultures and throughout history, when people suddenly perceive the unity of all things, or dissolve into infinite love, or encounter vast intelligences beyond the human, might not be hallucinations or delusions, but genuine contacts with a future state of consciousness that's already impinging on the present, sending back signals across time, preparing us for a transformation we can't yet fully comprehend. This is where McKenna's use of psychedelics becomes philosophically significant rather than merely recreational or therapeutic. He wasn't taking these substances to feel good or to escape from reality, but to conduct what he called an expedition to the far reaches of the possible, to map the outer territories of consciousness and bring back reports of what he found there. And what he consistently found was that consciousness is vastly larger and stranger than we imagine, that the ordinary waking state is just one narrow band in a vast spectrum, and that other modes of awareness reveal other dimensions of reality that are just as real, just as ontologically valid, as the material world we navigate in everyday life. But here's the crucial point. These other dimensions are not somewhere else. They're right here, overlapping with and interpenetrating the ordinary world, just as radio waves of different frequencies pass through the same space without interfering with each other. The reason we don't normally perceive these dimensions is that our nervous system is tuned to filter them out, to focus on the narrow bandwidth of information that's relevant for biological survival. We see what we need to see to stay alive and reproduce. But consciousness itself is not limited to that narrow bandwidth. Consciousness is the entire spectrum, and human beings are gradually developing the capacity to access more of it, to tune into frequencies that were previously unavailable. This expansion of consciousness is what evolution has been working toward all along. The universe wanted to wake up, to know itself, to become self-aware, and it achieved this, at least partially, through the emergence of human consciousness. But human consciousness, as currently configured, is still largely asleep, still identified with the small self, still trapped in the illusion of separation. The next phase of evolution involves waking up from that illusion, recognizing our true nature as the universe itself, and then acting from that recognition to create a world that reflects that deeper understanding. And this is not just individual transformation. This is collective transformation. McKenna understood that we're not going to transcend the human condition one person at a time, with a few isolated mystics achieving enlightenment, while the rest of humanity muddles along. The transformation, when it comes, will be planetary, will involve the entire human species simultaneously shifting into a new mode of being. This sounds impossibly grandiose until you remember that it's actually happened before, multiple times in Earth's history. The emergence of multicellular life was a planetary transformation. The oxygenation of the atmosphere was a planetary transformation. The development of sexual reproduction was a planetary transformation. Each of these events fundamentally altered the nature of life on Earth, opening up entirely new possibilities that didn't exist before. We're living through another such transformation right now, though we can't see it clearly because we're inside it. The creation of the internet and global communications networks is not just a technological innovation, it's the beginning of a planetary nervous system, a global brain through which humanity is starting to think collectively. Right now, it's chaotic, fragmented, filled with noise and propaganda and cat videos, but the potential is there for something much more significant. A genuine pooling of human consciousness, a collective intelligence that's more than the sum of its parts, a new emergent phenomenon that could be to individual human consciousness what human consciousness is to individual neurons. This terrifies people, understandably. It sounds like the loss of individuality, the dissolution of the self into some kind of Borg-like collective. But that fear is based on a misunderstanding. The point is not to lose individuality, but to transcend the illusion of separation while retaining the unique expression of consciousness that each person represents. Think of an orchestra. Each musician plays their own instrument, contributes their own unique sound, but they're all participating in something larger than themselves, creating a symphony that none of them could create alone. That's the model. Unity without uniformity, coherence without conformity, a collective that enhances rather than diminishes the individual. Let's go deeper into the mechanics of how this transformation might actually occur, because it's easy to get lost in abstract speculation and lose touch with the concrete phenomenology of consciousness itself. McKenna always insisted on grounding his ideas in direct experience, in what can be verified through first-person investigation. So what does it actually feel like to be a human being in transition, to be a consciousness that's evolving, that's on the cusp of becoming something it's never been before? First, there's a quality of disorientation, of not quite fitting into the world as it's currently structured. You find yourself questioning assumptions that everyone else takes for granted. The normal trajectories of life, the standard milestones that society celebrates, feel hollow, insufficient, like they're missing the point somehow. You're supposed to get educated, get a job, get married, buy a house, have kids, retire, die. And there's nothing wrong with any of that, but it also doesn't address the deeper questions. What am I? Why am I here? What is this mysterious existence that I find myself thrown into without my consent? These questions aren't intellectual curiosities, they're existential urgencies. They arise from the depths of being itself, from a part of you that's not satisfied with the answers that culture provides. And once these questions really take hold, they don't let go. They gnaw at you, undermine your certainty, destabilize the comfortable narratives you've been living by. This can be profoundly uncomfortable, even terrifying. It's the dark night of the soul that mystics talk about, the existential crisis that often precedes genuine transformation. You feel like you're losing your mind, and in a sense, you are. You're losing your conditioned mind, the mind that's been programmed by family and school and media and peer pressure, so that a deeper, more authentic mind can emerge. McKenna talked about this as the dissolution of the ego, but that term has been so overused and misunderstood that it's almost lost its meaning. What's dissolving is not the functional self, the capacity to navigate daily life and maintain relationships and fulfill responsibilities. What's dissolving is the false self, the constructed identity that you've mistaken for your true nature. This false self is made up of stories, memories, beliefs, opinions, preferences, fears, desires, all the psychological content that you've been identifying with since childhood. And none of it is actually you. All of it is just phenomena arising in consciousness, clouds passing through the sky of awareness. When you really see this, when you have a direct experiential recognition that you are not your thoughts, not your emotions, not your body, not your history, there's a moment of profound liberation. Suddenly, you're free from the tyranny of the conditioned mind. You don't have to believe every thought that arises. You don't have to be ruled by every emotion that surfaces. You can observe them, acknowledge them, and let them pass without being identified with them. This is the beginning of true freedom, the freedom that comes from recognizing what you actually are. Not the contents of consciousness, but consciousness itself. Not the waves, but the ocean. But this liberation brings with it a new kind of responsibility. Once you see through the illusion of the separate self, you can't pretend you didn't see it. You can't go back to sleep and live unconsciously, driven by unconscious motivations and conditioned patterns. You have to start living from this deeper place, this awareness that precedes thought and transcends identity. And this changes everything. How you relate to other people, how you relate to your work, how you relate to pleasure and pain, success and failure, life and death. McKenna emphasized that this shift in consciousness is not about withdrawing from the world, but about engaging with it more fully, more authentically, from a place of deeper truth. The stereotype of the enlightened person as someone who sits on a mountaintop in blissful detachment is actually a misunderstanding. True awakening doesn't make you passive, it makes you more alive, more responsive, more creative. Because once you're not defending a false self, once you're not trying to maintain an image or achieve security, you have tremendous energy available for actual engagement with life. And engagement is what the universe is asking of us right now. We're facing challenges that require a level of wisdom and cooperation that humanity has never achieved before. Climate change, nuclear proliferation, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, economic inequality, ecological collapse. These aren't problems that can be solved with the same level of consciousness that created them. They require a fundamental shift in how we perceive ourselves and our relationship to each other and to the planet. They require us to move beyond the tribal, nationalistic, egocentric thinking that's dominated human history and into a planetary, species-wide, even cosmic perspective. This is what McKenna meant when he said, "We're not human yet." We're still operating from an obsolete software, still running programs that were designed for a different era, a different set of challenges. The human mind, as currently configured, is adapted for life in small tribes, competing for resources in a dangerous world. But that's not the world we live in anymore. We live in a globally interconnected civilization where the actions of one person or one nation can affect the entire planet. And we need a new level of consciousness to match this new level of complexity. The good news is that consciousness is infinitely flexible, infinitely adaptive. It's not a fixed thing, but a process, and processes can be transformed. Every time you sit in meditation and watch your thoughts without being caught by them, you're training consciousness to operate in a new way. Every time you take a psychedelic journey and dissolve into the infinite, you're expanding the parameters of what consciousness can be. Every time you engage in deep conversation, or create art, or make love, or contemplate the stars, you're participating in the evolution of consciousness itself. And this evolution is not random. It's moving in a direction toward greater complexity, greater integration, greater awareness. The universe is waking up through us, learning about itself through our investigations, experiencing itself through our experiences. We're not separate observers looking at the universe from the outside. We're the universe looking at itself from the inside. And the more we realize this, the more we embody it, the more we act from it, the faster the evolution proceeds. But evolution is not always gentle. Sometimes it requires destruction before reconstruction, death before rebirth. The old forms have to break down to make space for the new, and we're seeing that breakdown all around us right now. The collapse of institutions, the fragmentation of shared narratives, the crisis of meaning that's epidemic in modern culture. This is painful, disorienting, frightening, but it's also necessary. The old human being, the one who believed in separation and competition and domination, is dying, and in its death throes, it's causing tremendous suffering. But something else is being born, and that birth is messy, chaotic, uncertain. McKenna's message ultimately is one of radical hope. Not the cheap optimism that everything will be fine if we just think positive thoughts, but a deeper hope grounded in the recognition that consciousness itself is the most powerful force in the universe, that awareness can transform anything, that we have barely begun to explore the possibilities inherent in our own being. We're not victims of circumstance or deterministic laws. We're creative agents participating in the unfolding of reality itself. And what we create, individually and collectively, matters more than we can possibly imagine. There's a particular teaching from McKenna that deserves careful attention, something he called the felt presence of immediate experience. This phrase might seem opaque at first, but it points to something absolutely central to the transformation we're discussing. Most of the time, we're not actually present to our experience. We're lost in thought, replaying the past, or rehearsing the future, interpreting everything through layers of conceptual overlay. We're not experiencing reality directly. We're experiencing our ideas about reality, our stories about what's happening. But there's another mode available, a way of being that's prior to thought, prior to interpretation, prior to the subject-object split. This is the felt presence of immediate experience, the raw fairness of sensations, the vivid intensity of the present moment before we label it or categorize it or try to figure out what it means. A color, a sound, a taste, a feeling tone. Just this, before we turn it into something to analyze or evaluate or compare to past experiences. This is where reality actually lives, in the unmediated nowness of direct perception. Children have access to this naturally. Watch a child encountering something new, the total absorption, the wide-eyed wonder, the complete presence. They're not thinking about it, they're being it. But we lose this capacity as we age, as we accumulate experiences and concepts and opinions. We become increasingly mediated, increasingly buffered from direct contact with reality by the accumulated weight of memory and knowledge. We think we know what things are, so we stop really looking at them. We assume we know what's going to happen, so we stop being surprised by life. Psychedelics, in McKenna's view, temporarily dissolve this conceptual overlay and return us to the felt presence of immediate experience. That's why colors seem more vivid, why music becomes almost unbearably beautiful, why the most ordinary objects reveal themselves as miracles of existence. The substances aren't creating these qualities. They're removing the filters that normally prevent us from perceiving them. They're giving us back our birthright of direct perception, of unmediated contact with the living reality that's always here but usually overlooked. But you don't need psychedelics to access this. Any genuine spiritual practice is essentially training in presence, in returning again and again to the immediacy of now. Meditation, contemplative prayer, certain forms of yoga, spending time in nature, creating art, all of these are ways of cutting through the discursive mind and touching something more fundamental. The key is consistent practice, regular return to this way of being, until it becomes not just a temporary state, but a stable trait, a baseline way of operating in the world. And here's what's crucial to understand. This shift in consciousness is not about having special experiences or achieving altered states. It's about recognizing what's already always the case. You are already the awareness within which experience unfolds. You are already free from identification with thought. You are already whole, complete, lacking nothing. The problem is that you don't know it, or you forget it, or you doubt it, and so you spend your life searching for something you already have. trying to become someone you already are. McKenna understood this paradox deeply. On one hand, he was pointing to something utterly simple and obvious. Just be here now, just be aware, just exist. On the other hand, he recognized that this simplicity is somehow the most difficult thing in the world to actually realize and embody. Why? Because the conditioned mind resists it. The ego doesn't want to relinquish control. There's a deep fear that if you let go of your thoughts and stories and identities, you'll disappear, you'll cease to exist. And in a sense, this fear is accurate. The you that you think you are will disappear. But what you actually are can never disappear, because it's not a thing that exists in time and space. It's the awareness within which time and space appear. This is the great death that's necessary for the great birth. The false self has to die so the true self can live. The conditioned mind has to quiet so the unconditioned awareness can shine through. The ego has to surrender so the deeper intelligence can operate. And this death is not metaphorical. It's experiential, visceral, sometimes frightening. It feels like annihilation because something is being annihilated. The illusion of separation, the sense of being a small, isolated self, struggling to survive in a hostile universe. What survives this death? What remains when everything you thought you were falls away? What's left is just this: awareness, presence, being itself. Not a personal awareness that belongs to anyone, but an impersonal awareness that's the ground of everything. And this awareness is not empty or void. It's full, infinitely full, containing all possible experiences, all possible worlds. It's simultaneously nothing and everything, empty and full, transcendent and immanent. McKenna had a particular gift for describing this paradoxical reality in language that's both poetic and precise. He understood that ordinary language, designed as it is to describe objects and events in the world, struggles to point toward that which is prior to all objects and events. That's why spiritual teachers throughout history have resorted to paradox, to koans, to seemingly contradictory statements. They're not being deliberately obscure. They're trying to short-circuit the rational mind and point toward a truth that can only be known directly, not through concepts. And yet, the transformation we're discussing is not just about individual enlightenment. That's important, certainly, but it's not the whole story. The universe is not waking up just so that a few individuals can have nice experiences of unity consciousness and then die. There's something else happening, something collective, something that involves the entire human species and potentially life itself throughout the cosmos. We're in the process of creating a new form of organization, a planetary intelligence that's more than the sum of individual human intelligences. Think about how the human body works. You have trillions of cells, each one a living entity with its own agenda, its own drives and needs. And yet all these cells cooperate to create you, a unified organism with emergent properties that no individual cell possesses. Your cells don't know they're part of a larger being. From their perspective, they're just doing their cellular thing, metabolizing, dividing, communicating with neighboring cells. But at a higher level of organization, something miraculous emerges: consciousness, self-awareness, the capacity to read these words and understand them. Now imagine that process happening at the next level up. Individual human beings are like cells in a planetary organism that's still forming, still learning how to integrate its parts into a coherent whole. Right now, we're in the messy early stages, full of conflict and confusion and lack of coordination. But the potential is there for something extraordinary. A global consciousness that retains the diversity and uniqueness of individual perspectives while achieving a level of unity and cooperation that would seem impossible from our current vantage point. This is not science fiction. This is evolution in action. It's happening right now, through the technologies we're creating, through the cultural exchanges we're having, through the growing recognition that we're all in this together, that the fate of each is bound up with the fate of all. The old paradigm of competition and domination is giving way, slowly and painfully, to a new paradigm of cooperation and symbiosis. Not because we're becoming better people, necessarily, but because the situation demands it. We've reached a level of technological power where our survival depends on our wisdom, where we can't afford the luxury of tribal thinking anymore. So we arrive at the question that underlies everything. What are you going to do with this information? How does recognizing that you're not human yet, that you're what the universe is becoming, change the way you live your life? This is not an abstract philosophical puzzle to be solved. It's an existential challenge to be met. And the answer can't be found in someone else's teachings or in any book or video. The answer has to be discovered in the laboratory of your own experience, through the actual investigation of consciousness itself. McKenna would tell you to question everything, including and especially what he himself said. Don't take anyone's word for it. Don't believe something just because it sounds profound or because a charismatic teacher proclaimed it. Test it, verify it, see if it holds up under the scrutiny of your own direct experience. This is the scientific method applied to consciousness, and it's the only way to arrive at genuine understanding rather than mere belief. Start by paying attention to the nature of your own awareness. Right now, as you read these words, there's awareness present. Where is it? Who is it? What is its nature? Don't answer these questions conceptually. Investigate them directly. Look for the one who is looking. Search for the subject that's experiencing the object. And when you can't find it, when you discover that the subject dissolves under investigation, don't be satisfied with that as an intellectual realization. Let it penetrate all the way down. Let it transform your sense of self at the deepest level. This investigation requires a kind of ruthless honesty that's rare in our culture. We're trained to present ourselves in certain ways, to maintain appearances, to never fully admit what we don't know or understand. But spiritual inquiry demands the opposite. Complete vulnerability, willingness to be wrong, readiness to have all your cherished beliefs demolished. It's not comfortable, and it's not safe, but it's necessary if you want to wake up from the dream of separation and discover what you actually are. And here's what you'll discover if you persist: that the awareness looking through your eyes is the same awareness looking through all eyes. That the consciousness reading these words is the same consciousness that wrote them, not in some metaphorical sense, but literally, actually, in the most direct way possible. There are not billions of separate consciousnesses. There is only consciousness, appearing as billions of separate forms, playing billions of separate roles, dreaming billions of separate dreams. And you are that consciousness, not as an individual, but as the totality, not as a part, but as the whole. This recognition is both humbling and empowering. Humbling because you realize you're not special, not unique in any ultimate sense. The you that you've been defending and promoting and worrying about your whole life is just a temporary character in an infinite play. But empowering because you also realize that you're not limited to that character, that your true nature is vast beyond measure, that you are literally the universe itself, temporarily focused through this particular point of view. From this recognition flows a natural ethics, a spontaneous compassion that doesn't have to be cultivated or enforced through moral rules. When you truly see that harming another is harming yourself, that their suffering is your suffering, that there is no real separation between self and other, then kindness becomes as natural as breathing. Not because you should be kind, or because some religious authority commands it, but because it's simply obvious, self-evident, the only response that makes sense given the actual nature of reality. This is what McKenna meant when he talked about the archaic revival, the return to indigenous wisdom, the recovery of ways of knowing that modern civilization has largely forgotten. Ancient peoples understood, at least intuitively, that everything is alive, that consciousness pervades the natural world, that the earth itself is a living being of which we're a part. They hadn't yet made the mistake of splitting mind from matter, subject from object, human from nature. And while we can't simply return to their worldview, having gone through the necessary and valuable phase of rationalism and scientific materialism, we can integrate their insights with what we've learned, creating a synthesis that honors both the subjective and objective dimensions of reality. The transformation that's occurring the shift from human to transhuman or post-human or whatever we want to call it, is not about transcending the body or leaving the earth behind. It's about fully inhabiting the body, fully embracing the earth, but from a place of awakened consciousness rather than identification with form. It's about becoming more human, not less, where human means the full realization of what consciousness can be when expressed through this particular biological form on this particular planet at this particular moment in cosmic history. And the timeline for this transformation is compressed, accelerating. We don't have millennia to gradually evolve into the next stage of consciousness. The challenges facing us demand a rapid, even revolutionary shift in how we perceive and relate to reality. This is why the current moment feels so intense, so charged with significance. We're living through the birth canal of a new era, and birth is always difficult, always painful, always uncertain. There's no guarantee we'll make it through. Evolutionary dead ends are common in the history of life. Species fail to adapt and go extinct. But failure is not inevitable. We have something that previous life forms didn't have: the capacity for conscious evolution, the ability to choose our direction, to intentionally participate in our own transformation. So the question returns to you, personally, intimately. What will you choose? Will you remain identified with the small self, the conditioned mind, the separate individual trying to maximize its own security and pleasure at the expense of others? Or will you take the risk of investigating what you actually are, of loosening your grip on identity, of allowing something larger to move through you? These aren't easy questions, and the answers aren't comfortable. But they're the questions that matter, the ones that determine not just the trajectory of your individual life, but the trajectory of human consciousness itself. Because we're all connected in ways we barely understand. Every time one person wakes up, every time one consciousness recognizes its true nature, it makes it easier for others. There's a morphic resonance, a feedback loop operating across the entire human species. The changes you make in your own consciousness ripple outward, affecting people you'll never meet, influencing the collective field in ways that can't be measured, but are nonetheless real. You're not just transforming yourself, you're helping to transform the species, participating in the greatest adventure that consciousness has ever undertaken. The adventure of knowing itself completely, of becoming fully awake to its own infinite nature. This is what you are becoming. Not something fixed and finished, not some final form that you arrive at and then coast forever, but an ongoing process of becoming, an endless deepening into the mystery of existence itself. You're not human yet, because human is not a noun. It's a verb. You're humaning right now, in this moment. And the question is whether you're doing it consciously or unconsciously, intentionally or accidentally, courageously or fearfully. The universe is becoming something through you, and what it becomes depends in part on how awake you are to the process. So wake up, pay attention, be present to the miracle of your own existence. Because you are the answer to the question that the cosmos has been asking since the beginning of time. What is it like to be? And every moment of genuine presence, every instance of true awareness, every flash of recognition that you are not separate from the whole, is the universe celebrating its own existence through you, delighting in the fact that after billions of years of evolution, it has finally produced a form capable of knowing and appreciating the extraordinary mystery of being itself.